Entrance Hearts. This is what I wrote shortly after they suggested I might need a heart transplant. Hypothetical heart. And if this heart could not handle more than my panting every time I turned the corner, or if it could only afford me a life full of limits and very modest goals, would that not be still a life? Would I need to tell my heart that sadly it failed? Is it that it did not love enough? Or perhaps that it always wanted to love too much? Or that it tripped itself by loving something that was not there to be loved? They say that its left ventricle barely pumps, and that its myocardium is less strong muscle than a bunch of scars. But nonetheless, my heart feels, flutters, moves the blood that gives me life. And I, the one whom this heart heartens, I walk, write, read, cook, play, and love. I don't know for sure if I would be able to climb mountains, or if I could face the dark assaults of fate. But my heart goes on, and so do I. And if they determine that this heart is not a good enough heart anymore, they say it would be necessary to order a new heart ready to go. The thing is that that other heart pumps another life now, a life, I presume, full and rich, the life of someone who can climb mountains and face anything that fate brings. But for that heart to replace my failing heart, that life, that supposedly full life, would have to stop, so its heart would start animating mine. And I know this would not be a calculated sacrifice, something planned in full awareness. This would be a heart whose life was accidentally ripped. And nonetheless, it is weird to think of that hypothetical circumstance, and I wonder how weak would my weak heart have to be for me to wish a new heart in exchange for someone else's life. There, on my first poem on the topic, you can hear my discomfort expressed by what I already perceived as the transactional nature of transplantation, a life saved only because another life is lost. I knew very little about heart transplants back then, and I still don't know as much as I would like. But bioethical questions were very clear to me as soon as the transplant was an option, was first mentioned. During my first heart surgery, a mitral valve replacement for a pig's valve, I had already wondered how much experimentation had been done over the centuries to arrive at that moment. I even asked my vegetarian daughter if she would be repulsed thinking of the pig's sacrifice to save me, when I could have chosen a mechanical valve that carried for me the sentence of being in anticoagulants for life. I was also shocked by all the medical waste necessary to prevent sepsis in hospital settings, the discarded plastic, and all the expenses invested on me. I wonder what my fate would have been had I not had job security and great insurance, or if I had been in my country, for example, in any city that was not the capital. I was conscious of my privilege. The awareness of the time, dedication, and material resources devoted to me was overwhelming. In a world in which many lives do not matter enough, so much was being invested in saving mine. I have been concerned for a while with the problem of how consciousness relates to our bodies. My book, Memory Matters in Transitional Peru, explored the connection between cultural products, our senses, cognition, and the construction of social memory. Memory Matters responded to a preoccupation with embodied memories and subjectivities, and the experience of illness brought these problems to the fore again. Illness creates a physical and emotional estrangement when our bodies act in unusual and painful ways. Our perception of our environment, ourselves, and others changes radically, as does the way in which others perceive us. Writing was for me a way to process that estrangement. Medical interventions altered my image of an autonomous body when mine depended on machines and blood transfusions. After what I thought was a period of good enough recovery, I considered myself no longer in fatal danger, but I suffered of atrial fibrillation that caused failure in several organs and landed me in a specialized cardiac clinic on the south side of Chicago. I lost consciousness for several days and underwent a number of surgeries I still cannot recall. Others have tried to fill up that blackout in my personal story. What I remember clearly was a persistent question in my mind when I woke up. What if it had been my brain and not my heart? Would I still be able to formulate that question? Would I still be me? Where does the self reside? Those questions have become, if anything, more persistent with time, as I have immersed myself in the study of health humanities while trying to understand the implications of a heart transplant. There are two predominant narratives of organ transplantation: the heroic one that depicts it as a miracle, and a horrific one that depicts it as an aberration. That first poem of mine showed an awareness of another side of the story offered by surgeons. If they could save my life, why could they not save that other person's life? I did not know this at the time, but I would flatline more than once, just 5 months after I wrote that initial poem. I remember losing consciousness twice, once at my karate school after a class, and once at an ambulance. The cardiologist who treated me at the ER of Illinois Masonic on the last day of his fellowship before moving on to a postdoc, and with whom I stayed in contact, told me afterwards that there were several more times. He did not say this with as many words, but I could have been declared dead. But he insisted my flinch was not just a flinch and did not pronounce me dead. He could have, someone could have, pronounced me dead as I flatlined. This is what my memory, or perhaps my imagination, has come up with from that experience. I assume this needs to be imaginary, although it presents to me as a memory of impossible circumstances, like talking to a nurse while they applied the countershocks of the defibrillator. For a reason not utterly clear to me yet, I narrate this as a short story using a third person, perhaps because the first person sounds implausible even to me. Here it goes. She herself. No, it hurts. If we don't do it, you're going to die. She felt that the shock of the defibrillator made her body jump several inches in the air over the gurney, and the pain, as if stricken by lightning, paralyzed her from head to toe. We should notice, of course, that such dialogue is impossible. If she was able to talk, there would be no need for a defibrillator. Nonetheless, those words sound clearly in her mind. And then nothing. Almost peace. And suddenly, her girls. Her thoughts come back, and the pain of thinking of their pain, the girls, without a mother. Too soon, no. An abrupt clarity and the need to come around. To come around where? Has she left? Has she left herself? Whose then is this voice in her head? Whose that aching body? To come around, wake up, open her eyes, to talk to the doctors and nurses making all that noise around her, to explain to them what happened. But she can't. Her eyes, her voice, her hands do not respond to her will. She tries again, and again she fails. She recognizes the voice of the electrophysiologist who treated her a month ago, the same one who thought that the danger of fatal arrhythmia had passed. He was obviously wrong. She also hears the young Romanian who was finishing his fellowship in cardiology. She sees them. She believes that she's seeing them. Somebody lifts her eyelids, shines a flashlight, but apparently there is no reaction. She tries again. She forces herself to shake her body with all her might. She believes that she shakes her body with all her might. In her mind, arms and legs flail violently, as if trying to knock off annoying bugs that have landed on her. She, a black belt capable of breaking 1-inch boards with her fists, puts all her strength into shaking her legs with no success. She wanted to say that she was alive. She wanted to beg them not to shock her again, tell them that it hurts too much. Concentrating, like she had never concentrated in her whole life, she tries to move one more time. A woman's voice says she's moving. The doctor comes closer. She hears him say, "Maria, blink." Another voice says, "She's just flinching." But the intern says, "Maria, blink, blink, Maria, blink." It was so weird that the medical personnel, to encourage trust, would call her by that first name that none of her friends would use. She concentrates in responding to his request, all of her strength trying to blink, and finally her eyelids respond. She blinked, they say, and then she feels that they know she's alive. She can let go now. She opens her eyes. Everything hurts, and surprised, she thinks, "I did not die." I did not die? What a strange thing to think. Her husband is by her side and smiles with tears in his eyes. He tells her what happened, the many surgeries, the transport to a different hospital with an advanced heart failure center, her organs shutting down, her kidneys, the dialysis. She looks at her hands and finds a couple of balloons inflated like rubber gloves or a collection of sausages. She had not realized how much her hands were part of who she was, the backs of her hands, that part of our bodies most exposed to our own eyes, even more than our faces, for which we need a mirror. Our hands are what reveals to us who we are. But that is not what she can see now. This is different, alien, almost obscene. Several machines are keeping her alive. She cannot keep track of the days that have passed since she collapsed at the dojo. She remembers the arrival of the ambulance, the emergency room, and now this present where time has become immeasurable, a series of intervals marked by doctors' visits and the changing of bandages. Her husband has decorated the walls of her intensive care room with photos of her loved ones and her most impressive karate demonstrations. They give character to their otherwise sterile environment, filled with machines, rhythmical beeps, and stupendous alarms. Doctors come in wearing friendly smiles and kind words. One of them points at one of the photos and says, "We'll get you back to that." She smiles, or at least she tries. The nurses who change her bandages praise her strength when she holds the rails of the bed for them to clean her back. She knows they are trying to be encouraging, but her eyes fill with tears. She was strong once, but not now, vulnerable in the extreme. Her best friend visits every day. She squeezes his hand the whole time he is there. He feels offended that nurses call her sweetie and honey. To him, that is infantilizing, disrespectful. For her, those names remind her of her humanity. as much as holding his hand so tightly. He might not understand that immersed in that soundtrack of beeping machines, in that sterile room, any tenderness is a lifeline, a vest keeping her from sinking, a ground wire, a cable connecting her to the mothership in the desolate, infinite space. What she cannot stand is hearing others use her name in the third person, incapable of raising her own voice, lost in a throat ravaged by tubes. What she cannot stand is not being able to support her own weight and the look of pity in others' eyes. In her dreams, she recovers her voice and rides her bike through sunny, tree-lined streets. In her dreams, she dances and laughs with her daughters and discusses topics dear to her heart with her closest friends. When she wakes up, she wonders. She asks herself again if she died then and now lives in a limbo, or if she's still alive, even if the others do not know she is still herself. These two pieces of creative writing I have shared with you already exemplify my search for ways to talk about experiences that challenge my sense of self. My rendering of what some would call an out-of-body experience, or even an episode of locked-in syndrome, deals with the fact that I could have been declared dead. I could have been one for whom resuscitation was halted. I could even have been an organ donor myself. My heart, obviously, was no good for anybody else, but I could have become a tissue donor of some sort. This has become more unsettling when I consider the fate of my own anonymous donor in the light of things I have read regarding transplantation. Chief among them has been Sarah Watson's Transplantation Gothic, tissue transfer in literature, film, and medicine. While her insights and contributions as a literary and cultural critic are enormous, the book has opened to me a series of paths I had been trying to explore on my own, and provided a rich bibliography on the history and bioethical discussions around heart transplants. Chief among the painful revelations of this book are the inconclusive discussions about the terminal death. I had considered myself safe from the really gruesome scenes of organ trafficking, but had not really considered the ways in which transplantation, as a miracle, as a gift of life, however, depends on not only on complex medical constructions, but also on symbolic representations. Even my uneducated self already felt a bit uneasy, fearing the predatory aspects involved in this process. While on the transplant list, I wrote the following poem: An Available Heart. Sharing the fate of the carrion bird, denied the elegance of a bird of prey, I will just sit tight and wait for the call. I know I am not an active killer, only someone whose subsistence depends on someone else's death. We can circle around the ideas and the words. We can present them as the gift of life or as a mere twist of fate, or we can talk about a heart becoming available as if it were something that arrives fresh at the store when in season. One nurse said, "You know, the summer brings so many motorcycle deaths." And so I cannot think about the actual heart. I cannot help but think about the actual heart and its beating in someone else's chest. I imagine him strong, young, risk-loving, full of life. I imagine he has a mother, perhaps even a child. But for this to happen, I need to just wait until we can talk about him as an available heart. I have to say that while I formulated my uneasiness in my poetry, I did not care, or perhaps I did not dare, to ask how death is established for organ transplantations in our state. To be fair to the medical establishment and to myself, I am not sure how much I would have been able to process information at the time I consented to being put on the transplant list. But from the 2020 retrospective hindsight, I wish I could have consented to receiving an organ only within certain definitions of death for my donor. My writing now veers away from poetic language as the scholar puts on her reading glasses. Thanks to Sarah Watson's book, I have discovered how transplantation has been facilitated not only by the advances in medical sciences like artificial ventilation and other life support systems and immunosuppression technology, but also by the crafting of discourses and legislation that have reconfigured our understanding of death. We have new vocabulary and new legal categories that make transplantation possible, such as neurological death, non-heart-beating donation or NHBD, and donation after circulatory death or DCD. While there is something called the dead donor rule that, I quote, requires that donors not be killed in order to obtain their organs, there is less agreement regarding, for example, the determination of cardiopulmonary death. I have to wonder, when my heart stopped, was I dead? In 1999, John A. Robertson wrote, "A key factor in observing the dead donor rule is the determination of death. The United States and most European countries now accept that death can be determined by tests that show irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions, or irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain. The latter tests for whole brain death, are necessary when the irreversible cessation of cardiopulmonary functions in a mechanically assisted patient cannot be independently established." I guess my cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions was not irreversible. It is still disturbing. Robertson adds, "Studies have shown residual spontaneous electroencephalographic activity in some brain-dead patients. To ensure that potential brain-dead donors are actually dead without risking warm ischemic time that would damage the organs, many programs establish protocols for NHBD. According to these protocols, life support is withdrawn already in the operating room. The recovery team waits for the cessation of respiration and of cardiac activity before pronouncing death. But the protocols are not devoid of controversies. One of the controversies is that drugs provided to prevent warm ischemia, such as anticoagulants and vasodilators, could cause or accelerate death. The second controversy warns about pronouncing death too soon. The idea is that if given more time after disconnecting life support, some patients might regain respiration and circulation. To prevent this from happening, many programs institute a 2 to 5 minute wait, but this depends on the laws of each state. Is the wait enough? Some argue that at that point the patient could have been resuscitated. Wasn't I resuscitated after my own heart stopped? Here the ethical medical questions is if resuscitation could be attempted unless the patient or the person with power of attorney had signed a non-resuscitation order. Are the doctors letting this person die? Are they actively killing them if they administer anticoagulants? Robertson seems reassuring in his assessment of the protocols. Less reassuring is to know that the criteria to determine brain death keeps being revised. The most recent literature review and recommendations I found was published only 2 years ago by the Brain Death Project Group in the Journal of the American Medical Association. This publication presents the results gathered at the World Federation of Intensive and Critical Care meeting in 2017 in Brazil. Without going into details I don't fully understand, the fact that there are differences in understanding brain functions and brain activity, for example, or diverging diagnosis of brainstem activity versus whole brain death is very disturbing, as is the thought of undetectable brain activity. From that terrifying scenario comes this poem. Elegy. Oh, tell me you were really gone. Tell me that you felt no pain. You, strange skin. Tell me you were not there when they saw your chest open, when they pulled out your tender heart. Was it beating? How? 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 A gift, they said. Was it? They were waiting for you, ready to make good use of your parts, love of mine, as if you were a dispenser, a supplier, and I a worthy patron. O heart of mine, this body that I am keeps growing, aging all around you. You, forever young. How can I carry forward? How do I live with what cannot be undone? I can only hope from my uncertain present that it did not hurt, that you were really gone when they gave me your heart. In Transplantation Gothic, Sarah Wasson devotes a chapter to the experience of organ recipients, demonstrating that there are very complex experiences that are often blurred behind the celebratory discourses about transplantation. The kind of language that refers to it as a great medical achievement, a miracle, and a gift tend to obscure not only the bioethical issues regarding organ procurement, but also the way recipients' lives are affected. Two qualitative studies carried out at the University of Toronto in 2014 showed that feelings of grief and bereavement appeared in both pre-transplant and post-transplant patients. In Getting Ready and Then Keeping Quiet, Exploring Grief with Pre- and Post-Transplant Patients, J.M. Poole and others conclude that this kind of emotion, known as disenfranchised grief, is pain not recognized by current social and political norms. Consequently, patients may try to keep quiet, disallowing themselves the outward mourning that may be cathartic. This is a result of a culture dominated by toxic positivity, the attitude that tends to dismiss negative emotions with superficial reassurances. This is the same impulse that privileges the full recovery narrative, and even as I now try to avoid it, I have participated in it. It was extremely ironic that on my blog on the platform Carrying Bridge, I wrote a sort of protestation to the prevalence of the stories of success without knowing that 2 days later I was going to fail miserably and that my life would be hanging on a thread for months to come. I entitled that entry Unsuccess and Inspiration, and I quote from Carrying Bridge. In the last couple of months, I have been getting a nagging, uncomfortable feeling when I am told that I'm inspiring. I don't know how to say this without sounding ungrateful and unappreciative. I certainly love feeling loved. And feeling loved has helped me struggle through some rough patches since November. But I somehow feel undeserving, almost ashamed. I feel uncomfortable with being praised for doing what I had to do, what I was able to do. It's very hard to explain, but today I found a posting in Heart Sisters, a blog of women and heart conditions that I have been following and that I highly recommend, that I think helps understanding my discomfort. It is entitled Survival Bias When We Focus Only on Success. And I quote, "The focus on success to a certain extent dismisses the experiences of those who do not succeed." And the following sentence also gives a gist of this. "The world's attention is itself consciously diverted away from those who are not there because they are either no longer well enough or no longer alive." And also, this preference for the positive can also support the false belief that those who succeed must clearly possess some uniquely superior qualities. I really want to succeed. I want to be alive and to have many more years doing the things I love. I love the idea of inspiring others. If my writing or my classes or my kata or my board breaking inspire people, it thrills me. But the feeling is very complex when being inspiring has to do with having the good fortune to not have died in a hotel in Marseille, to get outstanding health care, to have a wonderful network of family and friends supporting me. What if? And what about those who did not have such good fortune? When I wrote that, I thought I had turned the corner. I thought that I was on my way to a slow, perhaps limited recovery, but a recovery nonetheless. 2 days later, everything changed. I managed to survive. Since then, I have been called a star patient, a hero, a fighter, an inspiration. I don't think that my discomfort with those terms is only survivor's guilt. I felt that they erased a large part of the embodied experience of survival. I tried to express that in a poem during a period that followed when I was carrying ventricular assistance devices in my body and on the waiting list for the transplant. I'm a survivor. I'm a survivor. I'm not a hero. I just cling to life like any other organism, holding on to the life it's been given. If I stayed alive this far, it is because desire is stronger in me than the dubious allure of death. Nothing more, nothing less. I am a survivor. I'm not a hero. And if I look the monster in the face, it is not because I am not afraid. It is because I fear what might happen if I dare to look away. I'm a survivor. I'm not a hero. And if you find me inspiring, you might find me inspiring if you are also inspired by a lynx, an inkset, a leaf of grass, a tree. What I am trying to do with my current project, Trance Hearts, is to give voice to the complexity of my experiences. I want to be able to talk about my illness without resorting to the triumphal narrative of survival and happy endings. I also want to avoid dwelling on pain and hardship. I want to use language to explore the ways illness interpellates us. I want to acknowledge illness as part of life, a complicated part for sure, but a part that makes us reassess some of our assumptions of what it means to exist, to have a body, to conceive of ourselves as autonomous beings, to face mortality. Many times I have been asked if writing is therapeutic. I hate that question. I believe that I just need to write and thinking of it as therapy shines an utilitarian light on something that I consider an intimate part of myself. I have come to terms with the question, and now I recognize that there are therapeutic aspects to writing about illness. On the one hand, when my body had been completely taken over by machines after my vital organs had shut down, when I was intubated and could not speak, the mere act of writing, as soon as I could manage to hold a marker to an acrylic board, was like an anchoring for the self, an affirmation of my being. After the complete shipwreck of my sense of identity, writing was a way to recover some agency. On the other hand, writing, like many other activities, demands attention and thus distracts us from pain and worry. It is a clinically proven fact that distraction can be very effective in pain management, and an activity that engages you both physically and mentally can take you away from the intensity of the pain. Writing is my language. Others might use images or music as their primary way to express what moves them. While I often appeal to the written word, I do it in different registers. I am equally fond of the analytic language of scholarship, the musicality of poetry, and the tentative musings of the essay. At times, I also try to tell a story. When I started my blog on carrying bridge after my first incursion to the emergency room, people asked me why I decided to write about my experiences in that form. I got the same question regarding poetry when I published Thin Heart. I had no satisfactory answers. After years of much thinking and reading, I believe I have a few ideas, even if not really fully formed. I know that at times a verse comes to mind in specific words with specific sounds, and it begs to expand from that acoustic kernel. At other times, I am intrigued by the phenomenological questions illness brings up for philosophers, or by the discourses on posthumanism that appeals to the scholar in me. But at times, I just want to think through writing in free form, away from the academic jargon, or I simply want to tell a story. And that is why Entranced Hearts needs to be a multi-genre text, because the different facets of my experience call for different forms of expression, respond to different needs. While I have been working on this project for several years now, I still don't know what shapes it will take in the future. It still feels pretty much like an adventure, like exploring a labyrinth or spaces that are bigger on the inside. If anything, I hope that it invites its readers to ride along, that this trance might open for each of them different ways to understand what it means to be alive.